She was left to die. Her husband had taken the horse, the supplies, and what was left of their future. He'd left her and their son to the mercy of a blizzard that showed none. The wind howled across the Dakota prairie, a keening sound that promised a cold, lonely grave. Ava wrapped her own thin coat around her son, Leo, a desperate, useless gesture against the biting cold. Her fingers were numb. Her hope was a dying ember. Step by agonizing step, she dragged their broken sled through snow that was already knee-deep and rising. She knew he wasn't coming back. Jacob, her husband, had promised to ride ahead for help, to beat the storm. But she'd seen the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a man on a rescue mission. It was the look of a man cutting his losses. He hadn't just abandoned them. He had sentenced them to death. The blizzard was his accomplice, swallowing the trail, erasing their existence under a blanket of white. Leo whimpered in her arms, his tiny lips turning a terrifying shade of blue. His eyes were half closed, surrendering to the cold that was seeping into his bones. "Hold on, baby," she whispered, her voice a fragile crack in the storm's roar. "Mama's here. Mama's still here." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Mama was a ghost walking. Then she heard it. At first, she thought her mind was breaking, creating phantoms in the gale. A sound that didn't belong. Not the shriek of the wind, but something rhythmic, heavy, deliberate. Thump, 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 hoofbeats, steady and slow, cutting through the chaos. The sound grew louder, closer, until a shape began to materialize from the blinding white curtain of snow. It was a rider, a dark, imposing figure on a powerful horse, cloaked in thick furs. Long black hair, braided with feathers, fell down his back. As he drew nearer, she saw his eyes. They were sharp as obsidian, missing nothing. He dismounted with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the punishing weather, his moccasins sinking silently into the snow. He knelt beside her, his presence a sudden, shocking island of calm in the storm. "You'll die if you stay here," he said. His voice was deep and calm, but carried an edge of command that cut through her frozen haze. Ava looked up at him, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. "I was born dying," she whispered, the bitter truth of her life laid bare. "It's all I've ever done." The man's gaze was intense. He studied her, then the child nestled in her coat. There was no pity in his eyes, only a solemn understanding. Without another word, without hesitation, he reached down. In one powerful movement, he lifted her and Leo into his arms as if they weighed nothing. The sudden warmth of his body against hers was a shock. "Not anymore," he said, the words a low rumble against her ear. She wanted to fight him. She wanted to scream, to ask who he was, what he wanted. But the fight had been frozen out of her. Exhaustion, heavy and absolute, crushed her will. The last thing she saw was his face, weathered, strong, etched with a purpose that seemed as old as the hills, a face completely unafraid of the storm that was killing her. "Who are you?" she managed to murmur, her voice barely audible. "Tasun Wikasa," he replied, his voice steady against the wind. "Chief of the Bear Ridge Lakota." He turned and began walking, carrying her and her son as the blizzard raged around them. And a strange thing happened. The cold began to recede, not because the wind had died or the snow had stopped, but because of a feeling she couldn't explain. For the first time since her husband had ridden away, she felt that someone had chosen to stand between her and the storm. She didn't know where he was taking her. She didn't know if this was a rescue or a capture. But as she drifted into a black, exhausted sleep in the arms of the Lakota Chief, one thought echoed in her mind. He had found her on the brink of death, and he had simply said, "Not anymore." She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a very long time, Ava believed in something other than the inevitability of her own suffering. She believed in the strength of the arms that held her, and in a silent promise she felt in his grip. "You will not suffer again." but promises, she knew, were easily broken. And she had no idea what this man would demand in return for her life. Ava awoke to three sensations at once: the sharp, clean scent of burning cedar, the heavy warmth of buffalo hides piled on top of her, and the steady, quiet beat of her own heart. The storm still roared outside, a muffled beast trying to claw its way in, but inside this lodge, there was an almost sacred peace. Her son, Leo, was curled against her, his skin warm to the touch. His small chest rose and fell in a steady, even rhythm beneath a beautifully woven red and black blanket. The fever that had been consuming him was gone. She pushed herself up slowly, every muscle screaming in protest. Across the fire pit that glowed in the center of the round lodge sat the man who had pulled her from the snow. Tasun Wikasa. He was tending to a pot of simmering broth, his movements slow and practiced. He didn't look at her when he spoke, his eyes fixed on the fire. "You were nearly gone," he said, his voice as calm as it had been in the blizzard. "Your boy still had the fever when we arrived, but it has broken. He will be well." I should thank you," Ava stammered, her throat raw. "I don't have the words." He finally lifted his gaze, and his dark eyes met hers. They weren't unkind, but they were deeply searching, as if he could see every scar she carried, both inside and out. "Survival is not a gift that requires thanks," he said. "It is a right. You walked farther than most warriors would crawl. You have earned your breath." She took a moment to truly look at him. He was tall, even sitting down, with a powerful build that spoke of a life lived in a hard land. His face was a map of his life, carved with lines of purpose and quiet authority. His long hair was braided with strips of leather and what looked like polished bone. He was intimidating, but there was a stillness about him that was profoundly calming. "Why?" she asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. "Why did you help us? We're strangers. She trailed off, unable to say the word. White, the people who had taken so much from his people. He stirred the pot, the ladle scraping gently against the clay. "My mother was once left behind in a winter storm," he said, his voice low. "Another tribe found her and brought her to their fire. They did not ask her name or her people. They saw only a woman who needed warmth." He paused, his gaze shifting to Leo, who slept soundly. "And no child should die in the arms of a mother who was given no choice." Ava felt a lump form in her throat. She turned to look at her son, a wave of love so fierce it was painful washing over her. "He has no one else now," she said, the words tasting like ash. "His father—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. "He made his choice." "Then we make ours," the chief said simply. He set the ladle down and looked directly at her. "I have told my people that you and the boy will stay with us until the spring thaw. After the storm ends, the path you walk is your own to choose." His words should have been a comfort, a promise of freedom. But there was something in his eyes, something in the way he looked at her, that made her shiver for a reason that had nothing to do with the cold. It was an intensity, a focus that felt proprietary. It felt like he hadn't just rescued her. It felt like he had claimed her. "And you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why do you look at me like you've already made a promise?" He held her gaze across the flickering flames, his expression unreadable. "Because I have," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "In the old way, in my heart." She couldn't speak. The air in the lodge suddenly felt thick, charged with an unspoken meaning she couldn't decipher. Was this a threat? A proposal? A declaration of ownership? The drums she thought she'd heard before started again, a low, thrumming beat in her ears. But she realized it was just the frantic pounding of her own blood. He had saved her from the storm, but she had a terrible feeling she had just walked into the heart of a different kind of tempest. As her son stirred in his sleep and the wind howled on, she leaned back into the warmth of the furs, her mind racing. What did it mean to be saved by a man like this? What was the price of his help? For the first time in years, she wondered what it might feel like to belong somewhere, but she also wondered if she had just traded one cage for another. The next morning, the world was born anew. The storm had broken, and a cold golden sunlight spilled through the entrance flap of the lodge, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Ava stepped outside, her movements slow and tentative, and gasped. The snow, which had been her enemy, now glistened like a blanket of crushed diamonds spread across a vast, silent valley. The village was waking up around her. It wasn't large, perhaps 30 or 40 lodges nestled in a protective curve of the hills. Children, bundled in furs, were already laughing and chasing each other between the fires. Women with serene faces carried water in carved gourds from a steaming creek nearby. A party of hunters was returning from the tree line, dragging 2 fresh elk across the snow, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The entire village moved with a quiet, efficient rhythm, like a song the land itself was singing. Ava stood on the edge of it all, an outsider in borrowed clothes, feeling utterly lost. She was a ghost from another world. Where did she fit in this picture? She was about to retreat back into the warmth of the lodge when an older woman approached her. Her face was a beautiful tapestry of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. She held out a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. "Eat," the woman said, her English broken but clear. "Chief say you need strength." Ava numbly took the bundle. Inside was warm, soft flatbread, still steaming. She took a bite, and the simple taste of it, of nourishment, of care, was so overwhelming that tears began to stream down her face. She wept silently, not from hunger, but from the shock of a simple kindness. It had been so long, so very long, since someone had fed her without expecting something in return, without reminding her of her debt. The old woman simply nodded once, a gesture of profound understanding, and walked away. Later that day, as she was gently washing Leo's face with a cloth dipped in melted snow, Tasun Wikasa returned. He had been gone since sunrise, and now he strode back into the village with a brace of rabbits in one hand, his long braid lightly dusted with frost. "You are on your feet," he observed, his voice neutral. It wasn't a question. "Your people," Ava said, her voice slow and careful. They treat me like I matter." He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze unwavering. "Because you do," he replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You bled in the snow and still drew breath. You fought for your child when you had nothing left to fight with. That is enough to be honored here." Just then, Leo stirred in the pile of furs where she'd made him a small bed. He opened his eyes, clear and bright for the first time in days. "Mama?" he rasped, his voice still weak. "I'm here, baby," she whispered, her heart aching with relief. She took his small hand in hers. "We're safe." Tasun watched the exchange quietly. Then, to her surprise, he knelt in the snow beside the boy. His large frame seemed to gentle, to soften. "Do you know who I am, little one?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. Leo blinked, his eyes wide as he took in the imposing figure. He pointed a small, hesitant finger. "A bear?" A faint smile touched the chief's lips, transforming his severe face for just a moment. "Close," he said, "but I only roar when I must." Ava let out a soft, involuntary laugh. It was a rusty sound, unused for months, but it felt real. For a fleeting moment, the crushing weight on her chest lifted, and she could breathe. That night, after Leo had fallen into a deep, healing sleep, she found herself sitting outside the lodge. The sky was a vast, dark canvas pricked with a million glittering stars. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. Faintly from the other side of the village, she could hear the rhythmic beat of a drum. Tassin came and sat beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars. "You have not asked what happens next," he finally said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. She looked up at the endless sky. "Because I'm afraid to hope," she confessed, the words raw and honest. "Hope has been a cruel friend to me." "Then let me hope for both of us," he said softly. He shifted slightly, and his deerskin-clad shoulder brushed against hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth in the freezing night. "Stay here, Ava. Stay until your spirit heals, and when you are ready, I will help you build a life that no storm can ever steal from you again." She didn't answer. She couldn't. The words were too big, the promise too terrifyingly beautiful to accept. But she found herself leaning into his solid strength, just slightly. He didn't move away. Instead, he subtly shifted his heavy fur cloak, extending it so that it covered both of their shoulders, cocooning them in a shared pocket of warmth against the immense cold of the prairie night. In that shared silence, beneath the watchful eyes of 1,000 stars, she felt something shift deep inside her. It was like a rusty, iron-bound door in her soul creaking open for the first time. She didn't know what this man truly wanted, or what his heart promise meant. But as he sheltered her from the cold, she realized he wasn't just offering her a roof over her head, he was offering her a fortress, and she had to wonder if she was strong enough to walk inside. The days that followed melted into a strange and peaceful rhythm. The world, which had once been a place of constant threat, was now defined by the gentle slope of the valley, the warmth of the communal fire, and the steady, reassuring presence of the Lakota people. Ava learned to grind corn with a stone mortar, her hands growing strong and calloused. She learned to listen to the language of the wind in the pines. She learned the names of the children who now treated Leo as one of their own, pulling him into their games of chase and hide-and-seek. Her son was transforming before her eyes. The haunted, fearful look was gone, replaced by the rosy cheeks and easy laughter of a boy who felt safe. He was learning to track rabbits with the other boys, to fletch arrows, and to speak a few words of Lakota, which he would proudly show off to her in the evenings. The red feather Tassin's warrior had given him was now permanently braided into his hair. One afternoon, Ava sat by the edge of the creek, which now ran freely, no longer choked with ice. Leo was asleep under a nearby pine tree, tired out from a morning of exploration. She was washing their few clothes, her hands numb in the frigid water, letting the cold sting her back to reality. The silence of this land wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of watching eyes, the spirits of the trees, the whispers of the ancestors on the wind. And in that fullness, it told her something she had never dared to believe about herself. You were meant to survive this. The crunch of footsteps on the gravel behind her made her start, but she didn't need to look up to know who it was. Tassoon knelt beside her, his presence as solid and comforting as the ancient stones around them. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched the water flow for a moment before handing her a soft bundle of tanned leather. "I spoke with the elders," he said, his voice low and serious. "We believe it is time. We have a name for you, a name that is yours, given by this land." She looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. "A name?" "The name you came with belongs to the woman who was buried in the snow," he said gently, but with an undeniable finality. "This land, this life, gives you another." Her fingers trembled as she untied the leather cord. Inside the bundle was a strip of cloth, dyed a deep purple with elderberry juice. On it, painted in delicate symbols, was a single Lakota word. "We Chanpi," he said, his voice soft. It means star. He pointed to the symbols. Because you did not burn out when the darkness and the cold came for you, he explained. You held on to your light. You lit your own sky. Tears, hot and sudden, filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. I don't know how to carry something so sacred, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The weight of the name, of the honor, felt immense. You already are, he said, his voice dropping even lower, more intimate. You carried a child through a blizzard of ice and a storm of betrayal. You carry dignity in your spine, even when it is bent with grief. You are more than a wife who was abandoned. You are a woman who has been reborn in the fire. She touched the dyed cloth, half afraid it would dissolve under her fingers. It felt more real, more solid, than any marriage certificate ever had. Then let that be my name, she said, a newfound strength in her voice. A slow, rare smile touched his lips. It already is, he said softly. In my heart, it already is. That evening, the village gathered for a blessing under the sliver of the new moon. Wichanpi, stood among them. She was no longer Ava, the refugee. She was Wichanpi, the star, the medicine woman, a wizened elder with eyes that seemed to hold the history of their people, smudged her with fragrant sage smoke and tied a matching purple feather into Leo's hair. When the medicine woman spoke her new name aloud, letting it echo into the crisp night air, Wichanpi felt a physical weight lift from her shoulders, as if an old, heavy cloak she had been forced to wear for years had finally crumbled to dust. Later, as the fire danced and the drums beat a steady, hypnotic rhythm, Tasun came to sit beside her, their arms brushed, sending a familiar jolt of warmth through her. What do they call you? She asked, turning to him, truly seeing him not just as a chief, but as a man. Your name, Tasun Wikasa. It means horseman, doesn't it? He smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. That is the name I was given, but some of the elders also call me Tawa Unka. She tried to repeat the sounds, her tongue clumsy. Tawa Unka? What does it mean? He looked at her then, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. All traces of the stoic chief were gone, replaced by a raw, vulnerable honesty that took her breath away. It means, he said, his voice a low, sacred vow. The one who watches over what is his. Her breath caught in her throat. The implication hung in the air between them, shimmering like heat off the fire. And what is yours? She whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. He didn't look at the village, or the land, or the sky. He looked only at her, his eyes filled not with possession, but with a reverence that she had never known. You, he said simply, if you will have me. Wichanpi didn't answer with words. She couldn't. Instead, she slowly, deliberately reached for his hand. Her fingers, still cold from the creek, laced through his strong, calloused ones. It was an answer more powerful than any word she could have spoken. The night wind swirled around them, wrapping them in its embrace, feeling less like a chill and more like a vow being written across the stars. She had come here with nothing, a nameless woman dying in the snow. Now, she had a name. She had a son who was safe. And she had the hand of a man who saw her not as property, but as a star to be watched over. The peace she felt was terrifying because for the first time, she had something to lose. The peace shattered just after dawn. It broke apart like ice under a hammer blow. A hunting party, sent out at first light, came galloping back into the village, their horses lathered, their eyes wide with alarm. "Riders!" one of them gasped, leaping from his horse before it had even stopped. 5 of them, white men. They carry repeating rifles, and they are heading this way. Fast. A sudden, deathly hush fell over the bustling village. The sound of children's laughter died. The women stopped their work, their hands frozen in mid-air. Every eye turned to the center of the village, where Tasun Wikasa was emerging from his lodge, his heavy fur cloak billowing behind him like a gathering storm front. He listened to the scout's report without a word, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When the man was finished, Tassoon's dark eyes found Wichanpi where she stood, her heart suddenly a block of ice in her chest. "Does your husband ride with such men?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Wichanpi felt the blood drain from her face. The past she had thought was buried under miles of snow, and a new name was clawing its way back to her. She froze for a long second, the world tilting on its axis. Then she gave a single sharp nod. "If he's still alive?" "Yes," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "He would not come alone. He would bring others to finish what he started." Tassoon's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "Then they do not ride for land or for supplies," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "They ride for you." Wichanpi automatically reached for Leo, pulling him behind her leg. Her son, sensing the fear that was radiating from her in waves, clung to her, his small face buried in her deerskin dress. "I won't let them take him," she said, a fierce, protective fire flaring in her gut. "Or me." Tassoon placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, a gesture of both comfort and command. "You do not stand alone now, Wichanpi." He turned and began issuing quiet, clipped orders in Lakota. His warriors, who had seemed like peaceful hunters and fathers only moments before, transformed. Their faces grew hard, their movements economical and deadly. Some melted silently into the surrounding pine forest, becoming ghosts with bows and arrows. Others began to form a defensive line along the edge of the village, their weapons hidden but ready. The elders, with a practiced calm that spoke of long experience with violence, began leading the women and other children towards a large cave nestled high in the rocky hills behind the camp. One of the women gently tried to guide Wichanpi and Leo with them, but she stood her ground. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I will not hide. I will face him." Tassoon turned back to her, his eyebrows raised. "If he sees me weak again," she explained, her voice gaining strength with every word, "if he sees me cowering, he'll think he has won. He needs to see that the woman he left to die is gone." A look of profound respect entered the chief's eyes. "Then you will stand tall," he replied, his voice a low growl of approval. "And I will stand with you." The minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the howl of the wind, which seemed to have returned with a vengeance, as if heralding the arrival of the evil that rode with it. Then they appeared. Like wraiths emerging from the tree line, 5 riders came into view, their long coats dusted with snow, rifles held casually across their saddles, and leading them, his face gaunt and hollowed out, but his eyes burning with the same bitter, arrogant pride she remembered so well, was her husband, Jacob. "There she is," he snarled, his voice carrying on the wind. He pointed a gloved finger directly at her. "Living like a savage's pet, and she has my son." A cold fury, pure and clean, washed through Wichanpi. She took a deliberate step forward, leaving the protection of the Lakota warriors behind her. Leo cried out for her, but she held up a hand to silence him. "He is not yours," she called out, her voice ringing with a clarity and power that surprised even herself. "You left him in a blizzard to die. You forfeited your name as his father." Jacob's face twisted into a sneer. "I left you both where you belonged," he spat. "Outcast trash doesn't get rescued." Before the vile words had even finished leaving his mouth, Tassoon moved. He was suddenly beside her, a silent, menacing shadow. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence was weapon enough. "Speak another such word," Tassoon said, his voice deceptively calm, "and your breath will be your last." The other 4 riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. This wasn't what they had signed up for. They were now seeing the full picture, the line of grim-faced warriors, the glint of arrowheads from the trees, the unshakable calm in the chief's eyes. This wasn't some helpless woman they were collecting. This was an armed camp, ready for war. We didn't come for a fight," one of the men muttered, his hand hovering nervously near his rifle. "Then ride away," Wichanpi said, her voice like steel. "Here, you have no power. Your laws and your cruelty do not exist." Jacob glared at her, his face a mask of pure hatred. He had expected to find her broken, begging. He couldn't comprehend the strong, defiant woman standing before him. "You'll regret this, Ava," he hissed, using her old name like a weapon. But the weapon had lost its power. She lifted her chin, meeting his hateful gaze without flinching. "I regret," she said slowly and deliberately, "ever calling you a man." And that was it. The confrontation was over. His power was broken, not by blood, not by a battle, but by the simple, unshakable strength of a woman who was no longer willing to kneel. With no more words, Jacob and his men wheeled their horses around and retreated back into the trees, their threats dissolving into the howling wind. They had come expecting to find a victim. They had found a queen, guarded by a king. That night, the fire in the center of the village burned low and steady, a beacon of warmth and defiance against the vast, cold dark. Leo slept peacefully in the lodge for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, curled in a thick buffalo hide. The red feather in his hair was a splash of color, a symbol of the courage he had inherited and the protection he had been given. Wichanpi sat beside Tasun beneath a thick blanket of stars, the silence between them comfortable and deep. "If you hadn't been there today," she began, her voice quieter than the wind. Tasun looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the firelight. "Then the snow would have taken you," he said. "Or worse, he would have. Some fates are colder than death." He paused. "I did not ask you before about the man you fled, about what he did to you." "Why not?" she whispered. "Because I already saw it," he said, his voice gentle. "I saw it in the way you held your spine, even when you were freezing. I saw it in the way you watched the shadows. I was not interested in what broke you, Wichanpi. I was interested in how you carried the pieces." A sacred silence settled between them again. This man didn't see her as damaged goods. He saw her as a survivor, a warrior in her own right. Tentatively, she reached for his hand, her fingers finding their way around his strong, calloused palm. It felt like coming home. "I have never been chosen without being claimed," she said, the words coming from a place of deep, old pain. "I want to know what it feels like to be kept safe, not to be conquered." He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing through hers, holding her tightly. His voice was low, a solemn oath sworn to the listening stars. "Then stay, not because you must, but because this is where your spirit finds rest. And I will vow before the Sky Father and the Earth Mother that your pain ends here. This is your sanctuary." Tears blurred her vision, tears not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming gratitude. It was the crushing weight of safety, a feeling so foreign she had never truly known it. "Then I will stay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not as a refugee, not as Ava, but as Wichanpi, your equal." He reached out his other hand and gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "And I," he said softly, "will be your shelter." As the fire cracked and popped, sending sparks up to meet the stars, Wichanpi leaned her head against his strong chest. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart, a rhythm that was far more comforting than any drum. She was no longer prey. She was no longer a possession. She was Wichanpi, the star, a name given to her by a people who valued strength, held by a man who understood that the greatest power was gentleness. And in that moment, beneath the endless, watchful sky, she knew with absolute certainty that the blizzard hadn't been meant to bury her. It had been sent to carve the path that would finally lead her soul home. But a new threat was gathering on the horizon, one far larger than a bitter ex-husband. A storm of greed and steel was coming, and it threatened to sweep away everything she had just found. Spring crept into the valley on soft feet, thawing the frozen earth and breathing life back into the land. The creek swelled with melted snow, and the first green shoots of grass pushed their way through the mud. Wichanpi found a new purpose, planting corn and squash alongside the elder women. Their quiet companionship was a balm to her soul. She learned their songs, their stories, and the comfortable silence of working together for the good of the community. Leo, now fully healed and thriving, was a different boy. He spent his days chasing painted stones down the hillside, his laughter echoing in the clear mountain air. He was part of the tribe's pack of children, learning, growing, and forgetting the fear that had once been his constant companion. The community had folded them into its rhythm, not as guests or charity cases, but as kin. And Tasun Wikasa, the formidable chief whose shadow had once moved like thunder, now walked beside her in the warm sunlight. They hadn't spoken of marriage in the white man's way, with papers and a priest. They didn't need to. Their bond was woven into the fabric of their daily lives. The way he brought her the first wild berries of the season, the way she mended his cloak, the way they stood together, watching Leo play. It was a language the land and their people understood perfectly. It was a marriage of the spirit. But the world outside their peaceful hollow was changing. One afternoon, as she was teaching Leo how to grind dried berries into a sweet paste, a rider returned from a long scouting mission to the south. He brought news that made a cold dread settle in Wichampi's stomach. A new railroad was being pushed through the territories, a scar of iron and smoke across the plains. And with it came settlers, men with government papers, men with greedy eyes, and men with rifles. They were claiming Lakota hunting grounds, sacred lands that had belonged to the people for generations, waving deeds made of lies and promises made of smoke. That evening, a somber mood fell over the village. Tasun sat with his council of warriors and elders around the central fire, their faces grim in the flickering light. Wichanpi listened from the edge of the circle, her heart heavy. "We have known peace this winter," one of the elders said, his voice raspy with age. "But peace without readiness is an invitation to slaughter." Another warrior, a young man with fire in his eyes, added, "If we do not draw a line in the earth, they will erase us from it, first with their ink and their paper, then with their bullets." The men debated, their voices low and urgent. They were caught between the desire to protect their peaceful way of life and the knowledge that violence was riding towards them on a steel horse. Then, Wichanpi did something she never would have dreamed of doing months ago. She stood up and stepped into the circle. The men fell silent, their eyes turning to her. A woman, and an outsider at that, did not typically speak in the war council. But she was not just any woman, she was Wichanpi. "Then you must make this hollow more than just a village," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority born of her own survival. "Make it a refuge, a sanctuary for every tribe that has been scattered by their greed, for every woman they have cast out, for every child who has been left orphaned by their progress." A deep silence followed her words. The men looked at each other, then at their chief. Tasun looked at her, and there was no surprise on his face. There was only a deep, burning pride. "You speak not as one who begs for shelter," he said, his voice resonating with respect, "but as one who knows how to build it." "I speak as one who has seen what happens when no one is there to draw a line," she replied, her gaze sweeping over the faces in the circle. "And I have felt what it means when someone finally does." The council didn't need any more debate. A silent consensus was reached in the firelight. By the time the sun rose the next morning, The village was already transforming. This would no longer be just the camp of the Bear Ridge Lakota. It would become a nation in seed. More lodges were built, tucked deeper into the protective embrace of the hills. Scouts were sent out, not to hunt, but to carry a message, a whisper that would travel like warm wind through the broken lands. The message was simple. There is a place where the snow doesn't win. There is a place where the bruised can rise. There is a place where a woman with a child and no name became the star that guides others home. And Wichanpi, the woman once called Ava, stood at the center of it all. She had not been rescued to be kept. She had not risen to be admired. She had been rooted so that she could become a forest. They started arriving in trickles, then in a steady stream. A mother from a Cheyenne band, her 3 young daughters clinging to her skirt, their eyes darting nervously like cornered deer. An old Pawnee grandfather, carrying a small child on his back whose parents had vanished on the trail west. A small group of Arapaho warriors, their people scattered after a conflict with blue-coated soldiers. They came walking, limping, some riding worn-out horses, all carrying the same haunted look of people who had forgotten what it felt like to be safe. Wichanpi stood at the edge of the expanding hollow, a bowl of warm soup in her hands, ready for each new arrival. She had become the face of this sanctuary. She recognized the dazed silence in their eyes, the way they flinched at sudden movements. It was a look she had once seen in her own reflection. "You can rest now," she would tell them, her voice a soft reassurance. "You'll sleep tonight, and you will wake without fear." Leo, now taller and stronger, stood beside her. The red feather was still in his braid, a proud symbol of his place here. He had become her little ambassador of hope. When a young boy, whose family had been lost to sickness, arrived too traumatized to speak, Leo simply took his hand. "Come on," he said gently. "I'll show you where the best hiding spots are. We have a place for you." Inside the hollow, new shelters rose like prayers made of cedar, mud, and the sheer force of will of women who had once been taught that silence was their only shield. Wichanpi moved among them, a quiet force of nature. She taught them how to grind grain, how to stitch hides with bone needles, how to find the rhythm of the work songs. But most importantly, she taught them how to laugh again. She wasn't the strongest or the wisest among them, but she had a skill that was more valuable than any other. She had learned how to outlive storms. One evening, as the communal fire roared, a young girl no older than 10 stood clutching a small carved bone doll. She had arrived a week earlier, her face a mask of sullen anger. She approached Wichanpi hesitantly. "My father," the girl whispered. "He used to say that women should be quiet, that we don't get to decide things." Wichanpi knelt, bringing herself down to the girl's level. She gently took the child's small hand in hers. "Then your father," she said softly, "was a man who feared your voice more than he feared war." The girl blinked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Why?" "Because," Wichanpi said, looking the girl directly in the eye, "truth always sounds the loudest when it comes from the mouth of someone they tried to silence." Later that night, as the flames of the great fire danced against the dark silhouette of the pines, Tasun Wicasa stood before the entire gathered population of the Hollow, Lakota, Cheyenne, Pawnee, Arapaho. His voice rang out over the crackling flames. "Wichanpi." She looked up, startled to be singled out. He gestured for her to stand beside him. "This woman came to us with nothing but a dying child and the will to keep breathing," he announced to the crowd. "We gave her a name. We called her Star, but she has become more than the star in our sky." His gaze swept over the faces of the newcomers, the refugees, the broken. "She has become the one they follow through the dark. She does not lead with a warrior's blade, but with a sense of belonging. She builds our strength not with fear, but with hope. That is why you have come. That is why we are strong." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, tears glistening in their eyes. Others clenched their fists over their hearts in a gesture of respect. Wichanpi looked at Ta-Sun, her heart swelling. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "The greatest leaders never do," he replied, "but I will never run from it." And so, as the drums began to beat, a powerful, unified rhythm from many tribes, and the people began to circle the fire, Wichanpi finally understood. She hadn't just been saved so that she could be protected. She had been saved so that she could lead. Her light, the small flickering flame that had almost been smothered by the blizzard, was now a blazing beacon, powerful enough to guide a nation of the lost through the coming darkness. The night before the spring equinox, the air was still and filled with anticipation. Wichanpi sat with Ta-Sun beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient pine, the same tree where the first fire of the sanctuary had been lit months ago. The stars overhead seemed to form a canopy of woven memory. "The women ask me if I will wear the white dress tomorrow," she said, her fingers tracing the intricate beadwork on the blue ceremonial tunic that lay across her lap. It was the dress she would wear for their joining ceremony. I told them no. Ta-Sun looked at her, a question in his eyes. "I was buried in white once," she explained, her voice low but firm. "The white of the snow, the white of the wedding dress Jacob forced on me. I will not wear the color of surrender again." A slow smile spread across Ta-Sun's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He wrapped his strong arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Then you will marry me in your strength, not in their symbols," he said. "You will marry me in the color of the sky and the river. You will marry me as Wichanpi." She turned to him, her eyes searching his in the dim light. The time for games and uncertainty was over. They were about to bind their lives together, not just as lovers, but as leaders of this new, fragile nation. "And do you swear?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "Before the spirits, before our people?" "I do," he answered without hesitation. "Swear to me," she pressed, "that you will never leave when the storm comes." "I will not leave," he vowed, his voice a deep rumble in his chest. "I will stand beside you, and we will build the shelter together." "Swear to me that you will raise him," she said, nodding towards the lodge where Leo slept soundly, "as your own son, in your heart and in your actions." "He already is my son," Ta-Sun said, his sincerity absolute. "And when the world burns again?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "When their greed comes to our door, will we fight?" He looked out at the peaceful valley, bathed in the silver light of the moon. "We will fight only if peace demands it," he said, his words carefully chosen. "We will fight only when our silence would become a wound to our people." She nodded slowly, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She rested her forehead against his. "Then I am yours," she whispered. Not as a woman who was cast out, but as a woman who chose to rebuild what was broken. The next morning, the entire village gathered on the high ridge that overlooked the valley. There was no priest in black robes, no legal paper from a distant government. There was only the vast, open sky, the solid earth beneath their feet, and the circle of people who had all known pain but had chosen to build a future based on love. Wichanpi stood in her dress of deep blue and polished bone, the color of life. Leo stood beside her, his face beaming with pride, holding a ring carved from the antler of an elk. Ta-Sun stood across from her, a magnificent cloak painted with the images of hawks and stars draped over his shoulders. He looked every inch the king he was. The eldest medicine woman raised her hands to the sky. "Today," she proclaimed, her voice carrying on the morning breeze, "we do not bind them, we do not chain them together, we simply bear witness to what the Creator has already joined, the star and the shelter, the leader and the protector. When Wichanpi and Tasun placed their hands together, it wasn't a ceremony. It was a confirmation, a testament to the truth that survival could become something sacred, that unimaginable pain could be repurposed into a solid foundation. That love wasn't something that came after the suffering was over. It was the fierce, beautiful thing that rose directly from it. As the drums of many tribes beat as one, and the children threw handfuls of crushed petals and sacred ash into the air, Wichampi looked out over the faces of the people who now called her their Wichampi, their star. She finally understood her journey. She had not been rescued from the storm just to be adored or kept safe. She had risen from the snow to become a hearth, a central fire where the cold and the lost could come and find warmth. And Tasun, the man who had lifted her from death, had not saved her to hold her down. He had saved her so they could rise together, one breath, one vow, one dawn at a time. Their future was not a promise of ease, it was a promise of shared strength against the storms they knew were still to come. Years passed, flowing like a steady river through the tall prairie grass. The sanctuary, once just a desperate idea whispered around a fire, became a legend. It was a place spoken of in hushed, hopeful tones in the back rooms of trading posts, in letters that were never sent, and in the quiet prayers of women across the plains who still dreamed of a place where their scars would be met with protection instead of pity. The Hollow thrived, a vibrant, multi-tribal nation hidden from the grasping hands of the outside world. Wichanpi, now known by her name in every tongue that mattered, stood before the great council fire. The harvest moon, huge and orange, rose behind her, silhouetting her against the night sky. She was no longer the fragile woman from the blizzard, nor just the chief's wife. She was a leader in her own right, her voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through fire and ice. Her son, Leo, stood at her right hand. He was no longer a boy, but a tall, capable young man with his mother's steady eyes and his adoptive father's calm strength. The red feather of courage was still woven into his long braid, now joined by other tokens, marking him as a respected member of the tribe's warriors and hunters. Tasun stepped to her side, his love for her a quiet, constant presence that everyone in the hollow could feel. He handed her a folded piece of paper, brought by a scout who had just returned from a perilous journey north. "They have sent word," he said, his voice grave. "Another village to the north, a peaceful one, was burned to the ground. The survivors are making their way here. They seek the hollow." Wichanpi unfolded the letter. Her hands, which had once trembled with cold and fear, were now steady. Her eyes scanned the desperate plea for help. She looked up from the paper, her gaze meeting the eyes of the gathered council, the leaders of the families and tribes who had found refuge here. "Then we make room for them," she said, her voice ringing with unshakable resolve. "We welcome them with open fires and full bowls, just as we were once welcomed. We will not ask them to explain their scars." She turned to the entire gathered circle of people, men and women who had once been wanderers, exiles, living shadows. "You were not saved so that you could hide," she called out, her voice rising with passion. "You were saved so that you could become the sanctuary." A roar of agreement rose from the crowd, a sound like soft thunder rolling through the valley. It was the sound of a people united, not by blood, but by a shared history of survival and a shared commitment to hope. Later that night, long after the drums had fallen silent and the great fire had burned down to glowing embers, Wichanpi stood alone on the ridge, looking up at the same sea of stars that had once witnessed her near death. The blizzard had never truly returned. Not because the seasons had changed or the snow had stopped falling in winter, but because she and the people she led had become the warmth that no storm could conquer. They had built a fire so strong it could not be extinguished. Tasun joined her in the comfortable silence, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her against his side. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Not going back? Not trying to find a place in your old world?" She looked up at his strong profile, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "I did go back," she said. "I went back the moment I chose not to beg for my life anymore. The moment I stood up to Jacob, not for revenge, but for myself. The moment we decided to build this place, not to hide from the world, but to give others what I once prayed for." In the distance below, a child's laughter rang out in the night air, clear and carefree. A woman began to sing a soft Lakota lullaby, her voice carrying on the wind. The breeze shifted, bringing with it the sacred scent of cedar smoke and the unmistakable smell of hope. "Then the storm is truly behind us," Tasun said, his voice filled with contentment. Wichanpi nodded slowly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "No," she whispered, the truth of it settling deep in her soul. "The storm is always out there." She looked out at the lights of the hollow, a new constellation on the dark prairie. We just built a life strong enough to walk through it, together. Beneath the endless, silent stars, hand in hand, the star and the shelter stood as one, watching over the future they had forged from the ashes of their past. A future that glowed brighter and warmer than any fire that had ever tried to burn them down. If this story of survival, justice, and the power of found family moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories you won't want to forget. Let us know in the comments what you think it means to be a true survivor.